I'd been doing pest control for 15 years before the military picked up my contract, and I'd never smelled anything like what was waiting for us in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was the kind of odor that made your stomach clench and your brain scream warnings. Decay mixed with something artificial, something that shouldn't exist. "Jesus Christ," Corporal Santos whispered, lowering her binoculars. "Campbell, you seeing this?" Through the windshield of our armored transport, what should have been Main Street looked like something out of a fever dream. Thick, grayish webs stretched between buildings, some strands thick as my arm, others fine as hair, but gleaming with an oily sheen that caught the afternoon sun. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of the road, wrapped in cocoons of silk that gleamed wetly. A few shapes hung suspended between the second-story windows, shapes that might have once been human, now just dark silhouettes swaying in the breeze. The silence was wrong too. No birds, no insects, no traffic hum. Just the distant creaking of web-covered power lines and the occasional sound of something large moving through the structures ahead. "Driver, stop here," I ordered, my voice steadier than I felt. The engine died, leaving us in silence, except for the sound of our breathing and the distant creaking of web-covered power lines swaying in the breeze. Dr. Richards leaned forward from the back seat, his face pale behind wire-rimmed glasses. His hands shook slightly as he consulted a tablet loaded with satellite imagery from 3 months ago. Images that showed a normal Midwestern town with tree-lined streets and white picket fences. The industrial accident happened 3 months ago. Agricultural Chemical Corporation said it was just a minor spill of experimental pesticide. Class 4 containment protocols, they said. They assured everyone it was contained. Contained, I repeated, watching something the size of a dinner plate scuttle across a web spanning 2 houses. Its movements were wrong, too fast, too coordinated, like it was thinking instead of just reacting. Right. Sheriff Rugg, our local contact, hadn't said much since we'd picked him up at the county line. He was a big man, probably pushing 60, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of dealing with rural crime and domestic disputes. Nothing in his 40-year career had prepared him for this. Now he spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "My deputy went dark 2 days ago. Radio silence. Last transmission said he was checking on the Hendricks family out on Maple Street. We had 800 people in this town. Campbell. 800. I checked my gear one more time. The M4 carbine felt familiar in my hands, but I knew from the briefing that bullets weren't going to help us much today. The real firepower was the Mark 7 flamethrower strapped to my back. 30 pounds of liquid fire that would be our best friend if things went sideways. The weight was comforting in a way that surprised me. In all my years clearing out everything from termite colonies to wasp nests the size of cars, fire had always been the ultimate solution. "Private Walsh," I called to the kid in the passenger seat. 22 years old, fresh out of basic, trying not to look terrified. His hands kept checking and rechecking his equipment. Flamethrower fuel lines, backup ignition system, emergency oxygen mask. Good habits, but I could see the fear in his eyes every time he looked out at the webbed wasteland ahead. "You remember the drill?" "Short controlled bursts, sir. Watch for friendlies. Don't let them get close." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he held my gaze. "Fuel conservation is priority. These things burn, but they burn hot and fast." "Good man." I clapped him on the shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Santos, what's our fuel situation?" 4 tanks of napalm mixture each, plus emergency reserves in the truck. Should be enough for a standard extermination job. She paused, looking out at the webbed wasteland, her experienced eyes cataloging the scope of what we were facing. "Assuming this is standard." Standard. Nothing about this felt standard. In my 15 years clearing out everything from termite colonies to wasp nests the size of cars, I'd never seen anything that required a military response team. But the photos from the reconnaissance drone had been clear enough. Something in Cedar Falls had grown far beyond normal pest control. The satellite images showed web formations that covered entire city blocks, tunnel entrances that had been burrowed through solid concrete, and movement patterns that suggested coordination on a scale that shouldn't be possible for arachnids. We moved out in formation, me taking point with Richards close behind. The scientist's job was to collect samples and figure out what had gone wrong with Agrachem's experimental compound. My job was to keep him alive long enough to do it. Santos and Walsh flanked us, their flamethrowers at ready, while Sheriff Rugg brought up the rear with his old service weapon and a desperate hope that his 40 years of law enforcement experience would count for something here. The first house we checked was the old Patterson place. It had been a neat little two-story with blue shutters and a white picket fence. Now it looked like something had exploded outward from the inside. The front door hung open, and webs stretched across the doorframe like a curtain that moved gently in the breeze. I could hear something moving inside, a soft scratching that raised the hair on my arms, the sound of claws on wood, or maybe something worse. "Movement," I whispered into my comm. "Preparing to breach." The flamethrower's pilot light cast dancing shadows as I stepped through the web barrier. The silk parted like water, but it clung to everything: my gear, my helmet, my exposed skin. It felt warm and slightly sticky, and there was something about the texture that made my skin crawl. Inside, the house was a maze of tunnels carved through web walls, everything covered in that same grayish silk. The normal furniture was still there: a couch, a television, family photos on the mantel, but it was all wrapped in webbing like presents under a nightmarish Christmas tree. That's when I saw her. Mrs. Patterson from the general store, or what was left of her, hung suspended from the ceiling in a cocoon that left only her face visible. Her eyes tracked my movement, wide with terror, and I realized with a shock that she was still alive. Her lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words, but her throat was too dry, her vocal cords too damaged by whatever they'd done to her. "We got survivors," I called out, reaching for my knife to cut her down. The attack came from above. Something the size of a German shepherd dropped from the ceiling, 8 legs spread wide, fangs gleaming like black needles. I rolled sideways, bringing the flamethrower up as training kicked in. The creature moved wrong. Too fast, too purposeful, like it had been planning this ambush. The burst of flame lit up the room with harsh orange light, and the creature's shriek was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A sound that bypassed your ears and went straight to the panic center of your brain, a frequency that made your bones ache. It burned, thrashing and screaming, but more shapes were moving in the shadows. Lots more. I could see them emerging from holes in the walls, from gaps in the floor, from spaces that should have been too small to hide anything larger than a house cat. But these weren't house cats. "Fall back!" I shouted, laying down covering fire as Santos and Walsh poured through the doorway. "House is compromised." We made it to the street just as the entire front of the building erupted with movement. Spiders poured out, some small as cats, others large as coffee tables, all of them moving with the coordinated hunger of a pack hunt. Their bodies were wrong, swollen and distorted by whatever the chemical had done to them. Legs too long and jointed in places that hurt to look at. Eyes that reflected our flames like mirrors, showing an intelligence that shouldn't exist in something with an exoskeleton. "What the hell did that chemical do to them?" Richards gasped, fumbling with his sample kit while backing away from the swarm. "Mutated local spider population," Santos answered, her flamethrower sweeping back and forth in controlled arcs. "Made them big, made them aggressive. Made them hungry," I added, watching more shapes moving behind the webs that covered the downtown area. "Real hungry." The spiders didn't charge blindly like normal animals would. They spread out, flanking us, using the webbed buildings as cover. Some climbed up the walls and across the overhead web canopy, positioning themselves above us. Others disappeared into storm drains and emerged behind us. It was coordinated hunting behavior on a level that made my professional instincts scream warnings. We'd cleared maybe 50 feet of street when the ground beneath us started to vibrate. Not an earthquake, something else. Something big moving underground, following us through tunnels we couldn't see. "Campbell." Walsh's voice was tight with fear. "What's that sound?" Before I could answer, the asphalt cracked. The sound was like thunder, but wrong. Too controlled, too purposeful. Then it split with a noise like the world tearing in half. Then it exploded upward as something the size of a small car burst through the street. If the others were the size of dogs and cats, this thing was their mother. 8 legs like tree trunks, each one ending in claws that could puncture steel. A body that could have swallowed a person whole, covered in coarse hair that looked more like wire than anything organic. And eyes, so many eyes, that fixed on us with primitive but unmistakable intent. This wasn't just hunger. This was territoriality. We had invaded something's domain. "Run!" I breathed. Then louder. "Run!" We ran toward the truck as the street behind us collapsed into a maze of tunnels. The creature, I couldn't think of it as just a spider anymore, let out a sound like tearing metal and gave chase, its massive legs carrying it across the webs with terrifying speed. Each footfall shook the ground, and I could hear smaller spiders chittering in response to its call. Santos spun, laying down a wall of fire that sent the creature scrambling sideways, but I could see more shapes moving in the shadows. This wasn't just an infestation, this was an ecosystem. The spiders had turned Cedar Falls into their hunting ground, and we just announced ourselves as the largest prey they'd seen in months. As we reached the truck, Sheriff Rugg was already on the radio, his voice sharp with fear. "Command, this is Cedar Falls ground team. We're going to need bigger guns. Much bigger guns." But even as he spoke, I was watching the tunnel opening in the street grow wider, listening to the sounds echoing from below, clicking, chittering, the scrape of claws on concrete. I knew with cold certainty that bigger guns weren't going to be enough. We'd walked into something's home, and it had no intention of letting us leave. We made it 3 blocks before Walsh disappeared. 1 second he was right behind me, weapon ready, eyes scanning the web-draped storefronts through his helmet visor. The next, I heard his scream cut short. Not the kind of yell you make when you're startled, but the sound of someone being yanked violently away from safety. I spun around to find nothing but empty street and a hole in the asphalt where he'd been standing, the edges still crumbling inward like something had punched through from below. "Walsh!" Santos shouted, rushing to the edge of the crater, her boots skidding on loose debris. The hole was perfectly round, about 6 feet across, and it dropped straight down into darkness that seemed to swallow our helmet lights. "Tommy!" The smell rising from the opening was worse than anything we'd encountered on the surface. Concentrated decay mixed with something chemical and organic that made my eyes water. It was the smell of a predator's den, where prey went to die slowly. "He's alive," I said, hearing faint cries echoing from below, growing fainter by the second. The acoustics suggested a large space down there, maybe multiple chambers. "But not for long if we don't move." Sheriff Rugg grabbed my arm, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of someone who'd seen too much death in his career. "Campbell, those tunnels run under half the town. My grandfather used to tell stories about limestone caves under Cedar Falls, but nothing like this. If that thing's got him down there, then we go get him." I checked my flamethrower's fuel gauge, 3/4 full. Enough for maybe 20 minutes of continuous fire, but these creatures burned fast and hot. I'd need to make every second count. "Richards, what do you know about spider behavior? Hunting patterns?" The scientist was shaking, his sample kit forgotten on the ground beside scattered vials and instruments. His academic training hadn't prepared him for fieldwork like this, and the reality of what we were facing was clearly overwhelming him. They're pack hunters now. The chemical mutation, it didn't just make them bigger. It enhanced their coordination, their territorial instincts. In normal spider colonies, you have competition for resources, cannibalism. But this compound seems to have created something like a hive mind, collective behavior patterns. "So Walsh is bait," Santos said flatly, checking her own equipment with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen combat before. "They want us to follow." "Probably." I stared down into the tunnel opening, noting the scratch marks where massive claws had carved through dirt and concrete. The walls were lined with that same grayish silk, but down here it was thicker, more structural. This wasn't just webbing, it was architecture. But we're going anyway. The descent was worse than I'd imagined. We rappelled down using emergency rope from the truck, our helmet lights cutting narrow beams through air thick with spores and the sweet, sick smell of decay. The tunnel was just wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, but the ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in places. The walls pulsed with veins of webbing that seemed to breathe in the light, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. Or maybe it wasn't water. "Jesus," Santos whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Look at this." She was pointing to alcoves carved into the tunnel walls, dozens of them, each one holding a human-shaped cocoon. Some were fresh, the silk still wet and gleaming with an oily sheen that reflected our lights. Others had been there longer, the occupants reduced to desiccated husks visible through tears in the webbing. I could see clothing fragments, pieces of jewelry, a child's toy still clutched in skeletal fingers. 800 people, Rugg muttered, his flashlight playing across the nightmare gallery. Each beam revealed new horrors, faces frozen in silent screams, hands pressed against the inside of cocoons in final, desperate attempts to break free. They got them all. The tunnel branched ahead, splitting into passages that led deeper into the earth. I could hear movement from multiple directions, the soft skittering of smaller spiders, but also something else, heavy footfalls that shook dust from the ceiling and sent vibrations through the silk-lined walls. We found Walsh 20 yards down the left passage, wrapped to his chest in silk threads but still conscious. His equipment was scattered around him, his flamethrower torn away and smashed against the tunnel wall. His eyes were wide with terror, but he was breathing. The spiders had left him as bait, just like Richards predicted. "Easy, son," I said, cutting through the webbing with my knife. The silk was tougher than it looked, more like cable than thread. "We're getting you out of here." "Campbell," he gasped as the silk fell away from his throat. His voice was hoarse, strained. "There's something else down here. Something bigger than what we saw on the surface." I heard it moving, felt the whole tunnel shake when it passed by. "It's not just hunting, it's patrolling." Before I could respond, the lights went out. Not our helmet lamps, those were still burning, casting small circles of light in the overwhelming darkness. But something had blocked the shaft opening above us, cutting off the pale daylight that had been filtering down. The air pressure changed, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something large settling over our escape route. We were sealed in. "Move!" I ordered, helping Walsh to his feet. His legs were shaky, circulation returning slowly to limbs that had been bound too tightly. "Everyone move now." The sound started as a vibration in the walls, a thrumming that I felt in my bones before I heard it. Then came the clicking, hundreds of legs moving in coordination, coming from deeper in the tunnel system. It was the sound of an army mobilizing, responding to some signal we couldn't detect. We ran through passages that branched and twisted like the inside of an anthill. The webbing grew thicker as we went deeper, forming curtains we had to push through, leaving sticky strands clinging to our gear and making every step a struggle. The air was getting harder to breathe, thick with spores that made my lungs burn and my vision blur at the edges. Richards was taking readings with a handheld device, trying to track the source of the chemical contamination while we moved. "The concentration is increasing," he called out, his voice muffled by the respirator he'd finally remembered to put on. "Whatever caused the original mutation, it's more concentrated down here." "There," Santos pointed ahead. Light. It wasn't daylight. It was a phosphorescent glow coming from what looked like a chamber ahead. As we got closer, I realized what we were seeing, and my blood turned to ice. The passage opened into something that had once been a natural limestone cave, but the spiders had transformed it into something else entirely. The breeding chamber was the size of a gymnasium, the walls lined with egg sacs the size of beach balls. Thousands of them, all pulsing with an inner light that cast shifting shadows across the cavern floor. The sacs were translucent enough that I could see movement inside, shapes that would become spiders, but also something else. Some of the sacs contained forms that looked almost human, as if the genetic material inside was being combined, experimented with. And suspended from the ceiling like grotesque chandeliers were the fresh cocoons. Dozens of people, some still moving weakly inside their silk prisons. I could hear muffled cries, see fingers pressing against the webbing from inside. "Mother of God," Richards breathed, his scientific detachment finally cracking. "The reproductive cycle. They're not just using human hosts as incubators. They're incorporating human genetic material into their offspring." That's when we heard Walsh scream behind us. I spun around to see something that belonged in a nightmare dragging him backward into the darkness. Not one of the dog-sized spiders we'd fought on the surface. This was something else entirely. As long as a car with legs like steel girders and mandibles that could crush a human skull like an egg. Its body was wrong in ways that hurt to look at, as if it had been designed by something that didn't understand how living things were supposed to work. "Open fire!" I shouted, but Walsh was already gone, pulled into a side passage by the monster with a speed that defied physics. The sound of our flamethrowers echoing in the chamber triggered chaos. Egg sacs began rupturing in the heat, spilling out spiders the size of house cats that immediately swarmed toward us. But these weren't normal spiders. They moved with purpose, coordination, some of them walking on two legs like tiny humanoids. The hanging cocoons started thrashing as the people inside panicked at the noise and heat, their muffled screams adding to the cacophony. "We can't stay here," Santos yelled over the sound of burning silk and chittering legs. "The whole nest is waking up." She was right. I could hear movement throughout the tunnel system now. Not just the smaller spiders, but heavy footfalls that shook dust from the ceiling. The giants were coming, drawn by the disturbance, and we were trapped in their nursery with nowhere to run. "Richards, how do we kill them all?" I demanded, laying down covering fire as more spiders poured from the egg chamber. Some of them were burning but still moving, their altered biology making them resistant to damage that should have been fatal. "What's their weakness?" "Fireworks, but there are too many." He was fumbling with something in his sample kit, trying to work while dodging the smaller spiders that were getting through our defensive perimeter. "Wait, the original chemical compound. If I can reverse the molecular structure, create an aerosol version that targets their altered DNA. How long? I need samples." "Fresh samples from the egg sacs and the breeding fluid." I looked at the chamber behind us, now a sea of writhing bodies and flames, then at the tunnel ahead, where something large was approaching fast enough to make the walls shake. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful. Whatever was coming, it was big enough to be the mother of everything we'd seen so far. "Santos, cover Richards. Rugg, find us another way out of here." "What about Walsh?" Santos asked, her flamethrower sweeping back and forth to keep the smaller spiders at bay. I listened to the sounds echoing from the side passage, wet, tearing noises that told me everything I needed to know. Walsh had been dragged away by something that didn't just kill its prey quickly. Walsh is gone. We save who we can save. But even as I said it, a new sound reached us from the breeding chamber. Human voices, weak but definitely alive. Some of the people in those cocoons were still conscious, still breathing, still hoping for rescue. "Campbell!" Rugg called from ahead, his flashlight revealing another passage. "Found something! There's another shaft, leads up to the old grain elevator outside town." I had to choose. Take Richards to the surface so he could synthesize a weapon that might kill the nest, or try to save the people hanging in that chamber and probably lose everyone. The decision was made for me when the tunnel behind us collapsed, sealing off our escape route and trapping us in the heart of the spider nest, with something massive and hungry moving through the darkness toward us. Richards looked up from his kit, his face pale in the flickering light of the flames. "Campbell, I think I know how to stop them, but I'm going to need to get deeper into the nest. There's something down here, some kind of central processing chamber where they're refining the chemical compound. If I can introduce a counteragent there." The walls shook again, and this time chunks of earth rained down on us. Whatever was coming, it was close enough that I could hear its breathing. A wet, rasping sound that spoke of lungs too large and anatomy too wrong. "How deep?" I asked, though I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. "All the way down, to whatever's at the bottom of this place." In the distance, something roared. A sound that was part animal, part machine, and entirely wrong. The mother spider we'd seen on the surface had been impressive. But I was starting to suspect we hadn't met the real queen yet. And now we were going to have to go find her. The descent into hell began with the sound of crying. Not the chittering of spiders or the grinding of claws on stone, but human sobbing echoing from somewhere far below us. As we rappelled deeper into the nest, following Richards toward whatever central chamber housed the source of the mutation, the voices grew clearer. Men, women, children, all of them alive, all of them trapped in the deepest part of this nightmare. "How many you think are still down there?" Santos asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. We'd been underground for 3 hours now, and the psychological strain was showing on all of us. The constant fear, the claustrophobic tunnels, the knowledge that Walsh was dead. It was eating away at our resolve. "Doesn't matter," I replied, though the sound of those voices was tearing at something inside me. "We finish the mission first, kill the nest, then extract survivors. But even as I said it, I knew we were lying to ourselves. The people crying in the darkness below had been down here for weeks, maybe months. Whatever was left of them wasn't going to survive much longer. The tunnel system grew more complex as we descended. What had started as simple burrows carved through earth and concrete evolved into something that looked almost architectural. Chambers connected by passages that followed geometric patterns too precise to be natural. The webbing became structural here, load-bearing strands that supported the ceiling and formed intricate patterns on the walls. "Campbell!" Richards called from ahead, his voice muffled by the respirator that was barely keeping the toxic spores out of his lungs. "You need to see this." We emerged into a chamber that defied explanation. The size of an aircraft hangar, it stretched away into darkness beyond our lights. But it wasn't the size that made my blood freeze. It was what filled it. Machinery. Not spider-made, but human industrial equipment that had been incorporated into the nest structure. Massive chemical processing tanks connected by miles of piping, all of it wrapped in silk and modified with organic components that pulsed like living tissue. The original agrichem facility hadn't been destroyed in the accident. It had been absorbed, turned into some kind of bioprocessing plant. "Jesus Christ," Rugg whispered. "They're not just using the chemical that spilled. They're making more of it." Richards was taking readings with his instruments, his hands shaking as the numbers came back. "The concentration here is off the charts. Whatever they've done to the original compound, they've made it 1,000 times more potent. This isn't just causing mutation anymore. It's driving evolution at an exponential rate." That's when we saw the workers. People in agrichem uniforms moved through the facility, but something was wrong with them. Their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. As they got closer, I realized why. Thin strands of silk connected them to the machinery, to the walls, to each other. They weren't workers. They were puppets, their nervous systems hijacked by the same organism that had taken over the spiders. "Are they alive?" Santos asked, watching one of the figures mechanically adjust a valve on a processing tank. "Biologically, yes," Richard said, his scientific detachment cracking as he watched the human marionettes go about their tasks. "Mentally, I don't think there's anyone home anymore." A sound echoed through the chamber, deep, resonant, like a whale song but wrong in every possible way. The enslaved workers stopped what they were doing and turned toward us with perfect synchronization. Their eyes reflected our lights like mirrors, showing no recognition, no humanity. "Time to go," I said. But Richards grabbed my arm. "Wait. I need samples from the processing tanks. If I can analyze what they've done to the compound, I might be able to create a counter-agent that will poison their entire system." "How long?" 5 minutes. Maybe 10. I looked at the enslaved workers advancing toward us with mechanical precision, then at the darkness beyond the facility, where something much larger was stirring. "You get 2 minutes. Santos, cover him. Rugg, watch our 6. What followed was the longest 2 minutes of my life. The enslaved workers moved like sleepwalkers, but they were strong, stronger than humans should be. When we tried to stop them, they kept coming even with broken limbs and severe burns. They felt no pain, showed no fear, just kept trying to reach us with grabbing hands that left silk residue on everything they touched. "Got it!" Richards shouted, sealing sample containers with shaking hands. "I can synthesize a toxin, but I'll need access to the main processing center, the heart of the facility." That's when the real nightmare began. The sound came first, a vibration so deep it made my bones ache. Then the walls started moving, revealing what I'd thought was architecture was actually alive. The chamber wasn't built by the spiders, it was grown by something else, something that had been sleeping at the bottom of the nest until our presence woke it up. The queen wasn't a spider at all. What emerged from the depths of the facility was something that had once been human, but had been changed by months of exposure to concentrated chemical mutation. 20 feet tall, feet. Her body was a nightmarish fusion of human and arachnid characteristics. 4 arms ending in clawed hands, a face that was recognizably female but stretched and distorted, and eyes, dozens of them, that looked at us with an intelligence that was completely, terrifyingly sane. "Dr. Sarah Chen," Richards breathed, reading something from his tablet. lead researcher on the Agrichem project. She was supposed to be evacuated when the accident happened. The thing that had been Dr. Chen spoke, and her voice was like grinding glass. The evacuation never came. We waited. We adapted. We evolved. She moved with fluid grace despite her size, silk strands extending from her body to connect with the machinery around us. Through those connections, she controlled everything. The enslaved workers, the processing equipment, the smaller spiders that were now pouring into the chamber from every opening. "You cannot stop what we have become," she continued, her multiple eyes focusing on each of us in turn. "We are no longer constrained by the limitations of single-species biology. We are synthesis. We are perfection." I raised my flamethrower, but Santos grabbed my arm. "Campbell, look around. One wrong move, and this whole place comes down on us." She was right. The chamber was supported by organic strands that connected to the Queen's body. Killing her might bring down the entire facility, and us with it. "Richards!" I called, backing toward what looked like the main processing center. "How do we kill all of this?" "The counter-agent," he shouted back, dodging a swipe from one of the Queen's clawed hands. "I need to introduce it into the central nervous system of the organism, but it has to be done from inside the processing core." The core was a massive chamber filled with bubbling chemical tanks and organic components that pulsed like a giant heart. Getting there meant crossing 50 yards of open ground while the Queen and her minions tried to stop us. "Cover me," I told Santos and Rugg. "Get Richards to that core." What followed was urban combat at its most nightmarish. We fought our way across the chamber, while enslaved humans tried to grab us with silk-sticky hands and spiders the size of motorcycles dropped from the ceiling. The Queen moved through it all like a conductor directing an orchestra of death, her multiple arms striking with inhuman speed while she coordinated the attack through her web of neural connections. Santos went down first. A spider the size of a car caught her with a claw that opened her from shoulder to hip. She kept fighting even as her blood mixed with the chemical slurry on the floor, her flamethrower cutting through the advancing enemies until the fuel ran out, and she collapsed. "Maria!" Rugg shouted, trying to reach her position. But there were too many enemies between us. The old sheriff fought with the desperation of a man who'd spent 40 years protecting people, and wasn't about to stop now. His service weapon was useless against the larger spiders, but he kept firing anyway, each shot a declaration that humanity wouldn't go quietly into the dark. I reached the core with Richards just as the Queen realized what we were trying to do. Her shriek of rage shattered the chemical tanks around us, filling the air with toxic vapor that burned our lungs and blurred our vision. "Do it!" I shouted, holding the entrance to the core while Richards worked frantically with his synthesis equipment. "Whatever you're going to do it now." The counter-agent was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to kill the organism directly, Richards had created something that would disrupt the neural connections that held the collective consciousness together. Introduced into the central nervous system, it would cause the entire network to tear itself apart. But it had to be delivered directly to the source. "Campbell," Richards said, his face pale with the realization of what had to happen. "Someone has to inject this directly into the Queen's main neural cluster. It's a suicide mission." I looked at the synthesized toxin in his shaking hands, then at the chaos around us. Santos was down but still breathing. Rugg was surrounded but still fighting. The Queen was advancing toward us with murder in her too many eyes. "Give it to me," I said. "Campbell, no. There has to be another way." "There isn't." I took the injector from his hands. "Get the others out of here. Get to the surface and call in an airstrike on this location. Make sure nothing survives." The injection had to be made at the base of the Queen's skull, where the largest concentration of neural tissue connected her to the network. Getting there meant getting close enough to a 20-foot monster that could tear me in half without effort. I made it halfway before she caught me. Her clawed hand closed around my torso, lifting me off the ground with crushing force. I could feel ribs cracking, could taste blood in my mouth. But I was close enough. Close enough to reach the pulsing mass of neural tissue at the base of her skull. "You cannot stop evolution," she hissed, bringing me closer to her face. "We are the future." "Maybe," I gasped, pulling the injector from my belt. "But you're not going to be around to see it." The needle went in just behind her left ear, penetrating the soft tissue that connected her brain to the organic network. I pressed the trigger and felt the counter-agent discharge into her system. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The Queen's body convulsed as the toxin spread through the neural network, disrupting the connections that held the collective consciousness together. Around the chamber, the enslaved workers collapsed as their puppet strings were cut. The smaller spiders began attacking each other as their coordination broke down into chaos. But the Queen wasn't dying quietly. As her nervous system tore itself apart, she was taking the entire facility with her. The organic supports began to fail, chemical tanks exploded, and the ceiling started to collapse. I never felt her hand release me. The last thing I remember was falling toward the chemical slurry on the floor while the world came apart around me. I woke up in a military field hospital 3 days later. The doctors said Santos and Rugg had pulled me out of the wreckage just before the entire facility collapsed. Richards had made it to the surface and called in the airstrike that finished the job. 2,000 pounds of incendiary bombs that turned the nest into a crater of molten glass. The official report listed it as an industrial accident cleanup with 4 civilian casualties. The truth was classified at levels I didn't have clearance for. Agrichem was dissolved and its assets seized by the government. The town of Cedar Falls was declared uninhabitable due to chemical contamination. But I knew the real truth. In the final moments before the counter-agent destroyed her, I'd looked into the Queen's eyes and seen something that still haunts my dreams. She hadn't been lying about evolution. She'd been a prototype, a test case for something larger. 2 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital, there were reports of similar incidents in rural towns across Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri. Agricultural facilities going dark, entire communities disappearing overnight. Each time, the official explanation was chemical accidents or infrastructure failures. Each time, I knew better. The Battle of Cedar Falls was over, but the war was just beginning. Whatever Dr. Chen and her team had created in that underground laboratory, it was spreading, adapting, evolving. And somewhere out there, in buried facilities and hidden laboratories, more queens were waiting to wake up. I requested reassignment to the new federal task force that was being quietly assembled to deal with these incidents. My official title was Special Containment Specialist. My real job was to do what I'd done in Cedar Falls, go into hell and make sure nothing came out alive. The nightmares never stopped. Even now, months later, I wake up hearing the sound of that dying queen's voice. We are the future. Maybe she was right. Maybe what happened in Cedar Falls was just the beginning of humanity's transformation into something else. But if that was the case, I was going to make sure the transition was as difficult and violent as possible. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. Some evolutions shouldn't be allowed to succeed. And sometimes, the only way to preserve humanity is to burn everything else to the ground. The final after-action report contained a single recommendation: nuclear sterilization protocols for any future incidents. No more ground teams, no more attempts at containment, just fire. Clean, simple fire that would reduce any trace of the mutation to atoms. It was the only way to be sure. But late at night, when I'm lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I remember the sound of those voices crying in the darkness below. The people we never saved, the children who died while we were fighting monsters. And I wonder if we're really any better than the things we're trying to stop. The war goes on, the mutations spread, and somewhere in the dark places of the world, evolution continues its relentless march towards something that might not be human anymore. God help us all.